Dear colleagues, dear virtual audience, my name is Sonja Ganguin, and I have the pleasure to announce the second keynote speaker of our annual conference, Matthias Middell, one of the 3 spokespersons of our research institute. While most of you therefore probably know Matthias Middell quite well, let me nevertheless shortly say a few words about him. Matthias Middell is Professor for Cultural History and Director of the Research Center Global Dynamics, ReCentGlobe at Leipzig University. He is spokesperson of the Collaborative Research Center 1199, Processes of Spatialization under the Global Condition, and co-spokesperson of the Leibniz Science Campus Eastern Europe Global Area. His research focus is on international comparative history and on a global history since the 18th century. He is the editor of the Journal on Global History Comparative and has edited many anthologies, among them The Practice of Global History, European Perspectives and Verräumlichungsprozesse unter Globalisierungsbedingungen. In today's talk, Matthias Middell starts from the observation that social cohesion has become a key social concept in many parts of the world, and that the diversity of contexts poses a challenge for interpretation. Based on the work results achieved so far in our research institute, he outlines some hypotheses that can explain the rise of this concept and, at the same time, formulates perspectives for further research, which must be based on competencies for different world regions and cannot extrapolate from European experiences alone. Dear Matthias, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sonja, for this kind introduction. Let me start with 2 things I have to confess. One is one of my biggest mistakes I made in my academic career. I was invited to one of these preparatory conferences for this institute in 2017, I guess. This was after the first attempt by Michael Kretschmer and Professor Patzelt in Dresden to establish it as a strategic center for conservative thinking. And we were invited there to the BMBF and were asked to express our feelings about gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt, and most of the colleagues expressed rather their appetite for funding. And I was completely skeptical that this will last more than 2 years, this interest in gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt. Obviously, I was completely wrong. Second confession is that what I will present today here is not my own work only or even majoritively, but it is based on contributions that were made by many people within this institute, and in particular by all those investigating individual world regions or countries. So don't take me as the responsible for all the conclusions. I took them from this work that will be published soon or is already published. As I said in the introduction already, one observation that surprised me a lot is that not only we have a rapid rise of the term gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt in the German debate since 2015-16, which, for example, Matthias Quent has demonstrated in an article about sources from parliament and from media in Germany very convincingly. But also it has an equally rapid global spread. So what we see is social cohesion being discussed everywhere. And that raises, of course, a couple of questions additionally to the question, why is that in Germany so prominent? And perhaps both debates can mutually inspire each other. This raises, of course, a number of questions about contexts and courses, which I try to outline with a few brushstrokes. Because the topic as a whole can, of course, only be tackled by a coordinated collective research effort. This is evident. You need competencies for each individual case, and then you need the willingness of people being specialized on, let's say, China or Southern Africa to do comparative work. Two preconditions that are not per se given, because people are often very proud of their case and immunize themselves against any comparative effort. And I guess we will do a lot of this work also in the future of the FGZ, as we have done over the last years already as first steps. Let me do two brief preliminary remarks. One is, what is a key or basic term, inspired by that German debate about Grundbegriffe. Can we apply this term that was used by Koselleck, Brunner, and others in the 1950s already? And what is understood by these terms? So sometimes it is translated into concept, as conceptual history has it in its title. Sometimes it is more or less literally translated as basic terms. Sometimes it is addressed as historic semantics. Historical semantics is, I guess, a very important standard tool of any historical research. So when you open a monograph written by a historian, he or she would start with, my topic has the following development in the conceptualization, and then would start to tell the story. So, as an example, multilingualism is, of course, something we know today from linguistics as a term, but it has a history. Multilingualism was not always the same along the history of linguistic configurations, only to refer to the previous keynote. In quite different approaches, this historical semantics elicits how designation and the designated relate to each other in a specific historical context, and what we can learn from changes in this relationship. So that's the key definition of what these terms are good for. In Germany, the geschichtliche Grundbegriffe are undoubtedly the best known reference work. When you look into these various volumes, the authors use very prominent citations from works that were extremely well known at their time. And then it is, the idea behind that is that when a prominent philosopher uses the term in a certain sense, then you can conclude that in this period, the term was understood this or that way. There is a different school in historical semantics. I would call them the French school, where they were much less convinced that prominent authors give us an idea of what the term may mean in a certain historical period, but they used already from the 1970s onwards computers to put as much text pieces into the computer to say, okay, this term was used very often. People in media science may know that very well. And then you can say, okay, this term was very broadly used in a society, and now we figure out how we can conclude about the conceptualization of this term in a given society. I guess the Handbuch politisch-sozialer Grundbegriffe in Frankreich, 1680 to 1820, is the best example of a mix of both traditions. So when you look for reference, the first volume of that long series of contributions right now, which was published in 1983 by Rolf Reichert, this is the best reference, in my view, on how can we approach these basic terms. Second remark, over the last 20 years or so, people in conceptual history like Margret Pernau, Hagen Schulz-Vorberg, and others try to connect the history of historical semantics to the new tradition of global history. So the question was then, which terms dominate the discourse that is no longer limited to an individual society, but becomes a sort of international or global discourse. Searching then for trans-regionally circulating concepts that become as it were, the bearers of a global consciousness, or in which the global interpretative struggles of the present and past culminate. You see that is heavily ambitious, that presupposes that there is something like a global sphere of communication, and that you can identify it somehow by selecting sources being representative for this global discourse. And so far, I would say the problems that emerge out of this approach are not yet completely solved. So there is often criticism that certain notions like Bürgertum are not applicable to India. That was the argument by Margret Pernau, because there is a completely different understanding of middle class being in a colonized society, influenced by a British discourse, but also by Indian traditions of thinking, which have nothing to do with German Bürgertum, and so on and so on. So you see the problems, and I will not go into the details, only to demonstrate how difficult it might be to come really to valid conclusions of this source material and its interpretation. And we see that there is no common understanding of the same term, but that they are very often heavily disputed. Take examples like democracy. How many people say, from a democratic point of view, this is the following. Yeah. Compare it to how Vietnamese understand democracy in a completely different ideological setting and intellectual tradition. Human rights are another example where we have now really good monographs about the development of very different understandings of what human rights are and how we can trace the struggle about the interpretation of human rights into international negotiations, into media, into multicultural couples, marriages. Imagine only how these people may dispute what is a human right when I come from this or that tradition to understand that too. So that's only as two remarks that underline that we are by far not yet at the point where we can say the social cohesion is the following in that international discourse due to methodological to source problems. My central point now is that the growing importance of social cohesion as a basic term in today's societies cannot be understood without the direct relationship with ascending populism, right-wing populism. I guess that is very evident in the German context, but not necessarily evident to all contexts. That the emergence of right-wing populist movements and parties has provoked the debate about social cohesion. We can use various examples to show that it's not only German society that is thinking intensively about the state, the principles and the formats of social cohesion. I would argue that the leading event for this internationally growing attention was certainly the surprising Trump presidency in the US. This moment when Trump won the elections in 2016 triggered an intensive introspection of American society immediately afterwards, coming both from social sciences and cultural studies. So almost all of my colleagues started asking themselves about the American society after that surprise, and started a sort of reinterpretation of American society. They were completely shocked by the fact and started re-narrating the history of their country. And that led relatively straightforwardly to the diagnosis of polarization that poses a threat to society as an explanation for Trump's unexpected victory over Hillary Clinton. The fear expressed was that the basic principle of all democracies, that the opposing camps are in principle capable of accepting changing government majorities, and thus the temporary victory of the other side and became disputed, and it was no longer perceived as a natural objectively given advantage of a liberal democratic model of society. This all was called into question. And as we have seen then with the storm on the Capitol, as we can see in the current campaign for next year's election, or this year's election, it is clear that there is a deep doubt in the validity of the liberal democratic model of governance. There was a whole series of findings suggesting that Republicans and Democrats had each moved so far apart that they would no longer be willing to compromise. This was massively fueled by the polemic against the so-called deep state, which was supported by elites, in particular in Washington. The idea behind this was a denunciation of parliamentarism based in the capital, which in a two-party system would necessarily lead to the negotiation of compromises, albeit at the expense of the people in the states. Deep state, however, also meant the unscrutable rule of bureaucracy over ordinary citizens, a very old motive of North American populism, which can be traced back to the late 19th century. Another observation concerned a supposed new role of social media, which had led to a mutual compatibilization of political camps and their supporters, leading into incompatible parallel worlds like the rabbit holes we know from Alice in Wonderland. The algorithms of Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms would control, that was the story, this process to a much greater degree than was possible in the realm of traditional media. And you can see how much this original observation, which was the outcome of a shock in 2017, has spread over the world and has inspired research everywhere into the same direction. Once the hypothesis was in the world, I would say thousands of researchers started trying to demonstrate that it is true. In addition, a significant effect of election manipulation by Russian trolls was speculated, which would further deepen and take advantage of the polarization process already set in motion in the US and in other respective countries. So the interpretation is not that something happens because the Russians have manipulated, but this international connectivity has only had a chance because there was already a process ongoing in the country. The painting of a self-observation of American society, which can only be indicated here in the briefest of brushstrokes, was due to the surprise of American liberals at Hillary Clinton's defeat and Donald Trump's rise in 2016, which was hardly thought possible. International participants in the debate, in turn, looked now for striking parallels to events in their own societies and for global trends that might confirm what was happening in the United States. So the United States were very easily accepted as a model that we can see repeated everywhere. And once you look for something, you will discover it. And that is what happened in the next couple of years. Attention to populist movements and regimes increased by leaps and bounds, and within a very short time, the right-wing populist threat appeared omnipresent. However, this happened at the cost of right-wing populism becoming a diagnosis applied to very different phenomena. It cannot be overlooked that the FGZ's academic program, paradoxically, also owes much to this observation. Yeah, so we are the profiteers of that intellectual movement to some extent. Parallel work, for example, by Poole in 2020, has pointed out that populism is not a new phenomenon. It is nothing that appeared only in the 2010s, but has a long history that goes back at least to the 19th century. I would argue even to the French Revolution, but I will not bother you now with the French Revolution's history, but rather with the argument by Poole, who says that the populist party in the 1890s was one of the major formats of populist movements in the history, which establishes a reference, and therefore the term populism was used to characterize these movements. Furthermore, it is possible to identify different waves in which populist movements could be observed in different parts of the world, each of which had to deal with very different constellations. For example, the Populist Party protest in the US in the 1890s was directed against the omnipotence of the East Coast financial bourgeoisie and railroad magnates. Populism in Latin America from 1910 onwards, on the other hand, turned against an agrarian trade capitalist oligarchy that neglected the industrialization of its own country. You see completely different social configurations behind. Populism in France after 1960, which is characterized by a very strange direct continuity in the Le Pen family to the present day, masking the many transformations that have also taken place in this movement over the last 60 years, was a reaction to the loss of power and prestige of the former empire in the course of decolonization. The populism of the 1990s in Eastern and East Central Europe had much to do with the devastating social effects of the post-1989 transformation. And I could go on and on and on and show you like how historically very different populisms follow each other and have very different contexts. Let us note the term social cohesion is actually a byproduct of observing the surprisingly successful right-wing populism. The term was invented in order to defend something that had previously existed, which was supposed to be endangered now by populism. In introspection, mainly from liberal pens, a fundamental attack on liberal democratic structures, mechanisms, and values was to be described. Why so many were leaving the consensus of the welfare state was more the subject of leftists and left liberals. At the same time, the first efforts could be observed to claim the term social cohesion for homogenizing fantasies of a new nationalism with corresponding accompanying tones of xenophobia, racism, and homophobia. Thus, from the beginning, the term was not the property of one single political ideological direction. Rather, it was precisely in that phase of emergence, iridescence, and underdetermination that the struggles for which social narrative it might be particularly useful were already setting in. In most cases that followed after 2016, populism can be fairly clearly characterized as right-wing populism, mobilizing long-established repertoires of nationalism, homophobia, and racism, sometimes overtly embracing elements of anti-Semitism, and seeking to recruit a mass base that shares dissatisfaction with the liberal model of society and with the limited capacity of the state to address the multiple challenges of the current multi-crisis. This has been described by some interpreters as a shallow ideology, although a core is increasingly emerging that draws primarily on central elements of the conservative critique of liberalism that can be observed since late 18th century. This also results in a considerable affinity of conservative circles to this right-wing populist program. And obviously we are here in a state where the question whether this wall will hold or not is not yet completely decided. However, it is also possible to identify a quite noteworthy left-wing populist current that tends to draw on the repertoire of an egalitarian critique of liberalism and more intensively addresses the social disadvantages associated with the liberal model of society. The confusion between right-wing populism and left-wing populism has different consequences. On the one hand, it serves liberals to formulate a horseshoe theory, according to which the various populist movements are more similar than they claim to be. This makes it possible to construct a center of society that must be defended against the extremes. The equation of left-wing populism and right-wing populism can thus also be interpreted as a form of restoring a certain type of social cohesion. The thesis of the threat to cohesion posed by the rise of populism draws attention to the fact that right-wing populism in particular has developed a remarkable ability to build a broad mass base based on the discontent of broader segments of population. Descriptions of this expansion of an electorate that now enables electoral victories in some countries, think of Hungary and Poland, the UK of Brexit, but also Italy, or at least can generate constitutional blocking minorities, are becoming increasingly dramatic. They serve as the example of the last 3 French presidential elections has shown to mobilize the left to elect social or liberal democratic candidates as the lesser evil. However, this mechanism, and this is what we can see now in the protest against Macron, obviously wears out to the extent that the question of the causes of broad discontent is avoided. On the other hand, it is certainly questionable whether the term left-wing populism actually has much analytical potential. On the one hand, it is about the lines of tradition of the criticism of globalization from the left, which was already loudly advocated around 2000 and continues to reverberate in the populist repertoire to this day. On the other hand, it is mainly about the analysis of government policy in China. The model of populism from above there seems to be a contradiction in terms, but it manages to readjust the tradition of Maoism so that it functions as a polemic against corrupt sections of the elite without endangering the elite of the Communist Party itself. Manchang has thoroughly analyzed this and shown how Xi Jinping not only promotes this model of unity between the people and the political leadership against the economic elites, or some parts of the economic elites, as an anchor of stability in his own country, but also propagates it as a model of social cohesion worthy of imitation internationally, which is superior to the model of Western liberalism. What we see in many African countries, in many Asian countries, and somehow also in Latin America, is a fascination with the Chinese model of stabilization of social cohesion, against which the Western idea of organizing so-called democratic social cohesion seems to be in disadvantage. Social cohesion is understood here in China as the commitment of the individual to the common goals of society, which are not only defined by the Communist Party leadership, but also controlled with the help of social discipline elements. Let's look only at this point system, which honors good behavior in society. A completely different variant of a supposed left-wing populism is the South African freedom fighters under Malema's leadership. Here, too, the contextual nature of the debate about social cohesion is abundantly clear. Disappointment with post-apartheid policies is expressed as a threat to social cohesion and positioned against the majority of the ANC. Studies by Constanze Blum and Ulf Engel have drawn attention for the first time to how the debate about social cohesion is spreading in Southern Africa. In a thematic issue, they have presented different variants of this discussion in Namibia, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, but also compared them with the situation in Ethiopia. Christy van der Westhuizen will also present us tomorrow with new material from this region of the world here at the conference. The recent upheavals in the Sahel have arguably put Africa definitively on the map of populism studies. Some describe the military coups as populist movements. Others, like Achille Bembe, as expression of a highly dynamic neo-sovereignism. If there is a difference or not remains to be discussed, but we can take a characterization of what populism might be from this debate. Are these violent reactions to the continued presence of France in particular and its favorites in government offices of Mali or Niger to be put on the same level as Le Pen or Orban? Or is this a form of decolonization? Much is still open, partly because the situation is heavily volatile, but what seems clear is that Africa deserves a prominent place with added analytical value in future handbooks of social cohesion and populism. I say that because Africa was always present in these handbooks, but only as a chapter. We have also to do something on Africa. Yeah, but it has never an analytical value. When you read the introductions, somewhere page 457, there is then a short chapter on these strange people there. And I guess that is what we are about to overcome right now. I guess often social cohesion appears as a concept defending rather conservatively a world that is about to get lost. I guess that is the danger, and that is often addressed in this criticism. And the African Union, for example, discusses it as no one is allowed to change a constitutional regime, and therefore the ban on Niger and Mali, etc. But the question is, what do we then with terms like revolution, like democratic change, etc., when there is obvious and anti-colonization in our analysis? Is there a new constitution of social cohesion, of a configuration of social cohesion? Or is social cohesion something that is given forever and has to be defended against everyone who puts stability in society into question? Social cohesion or gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt has developed into a key or basic term or concept of today's societal description, but it is so within a wider semantic field, which I will in the following briefly lay out along 5 different terms or concepts. Such semantic fields are necessary to analyze in order to understand how key terms work as main pillars of dominant societal narratives. Someone seems to be dissatisfied with what I'm saying. Okay, the 5 points, and I will brief on them. The first is globalism. What ultimately brings all these cases, to which one could easily add India's Modi's India or Indonesia or even Vietnam together. What is relevant for the history of concepts is that everywhere there is talk about social cohesion and its endangerment. But what endangers it? Populism gains its homogeneity across borders primarily from its reference to the globalization ideology of the 1990s. Globalism and globalists are the enemy images that populism from both the right and the left has been working off in a wide variety of ways ever since. In doing so, it enters into links with anti-Semitism when it attacks a global financial elite with Jewish roots. It invokes a long legacy of colonial hardened racism and xenophobia when it fulminates against immigration as an effect of pluralism. And it emphasizes national identities in an extremely pointed nationalist way. For example, in rejecting an alleged German guild cult or violated Hungarian Christian identity in a Muslim environment, and so on and so on. And when it marks migration as a concomitant of globalization and basically presents it as avoidable and to be stopped. In doing so, populism takes advantage of the fact that the promises of this liberal ideology of globalization, as spread especially after 1989-91 in a sort of triumphalist discourse, have not been fulfilled, and that little has been said about the social costs of opening borders, lengthening the value chains, and enormously expanding financialization. However, populism is also confronted with the contradictory nature of the situation since the 2010s. Even if the naive enthusiasm for globalization has not been fulfilled, the inescapability of global interdependencies remain, and we see it with populist movements themselves. Russian sources finance French populists. So they depend themselves from these global connections, not only that they have to accept that they exist. Among the difficulties faced by populism is the question of what to do with immigrants who have already been naturalized. What to do with inhabitants of the overseas territories of former colonial powers, or how to deal with the now cherished benefits of freedom of movement, like tourism. Populism is currently unable to find workable solutions to some of these dilemmas, but it seeks to offer as few attack surfaces as possible to those who reject pluralism in principle, but who would like to continue to be confronted with the advantages of global interdependence. Therese Meger has impressively demonstrated this search for the smallest possible attack surface using the example of the French Rassemblement National, and observed how traditional positions for which the French right-wing populists had long been known have been swept away with relative ease, with the first representatives, black and colored representatives of the Rassemblement National to the French elections from overseas territories. And recently I saw a picture of Jon Höcke with an African descending person now representing how multicolored, obviously, the AfD would like to appear. In contrast, China's governing populism connects very well with the idea of China as the protector of free trade, non-intervention into internal affairs, and focus on global infrastructure, in short, of traditional globalization. So it is not so evident that all populisms reject globalism, in fact. And one of the attractiveness of the Chinese model is that they take the role the US claimed for themselves in 1990-2000 and present themselves as the protector of a functioning globalized world with new infrastructure being provided by Chinese investment. So story is not that easy. Second term of this semantic field is transformation. This is again a very vague term with many interpretations and narratives being connected to it. But obviously it is on its way to move away from the understanding of transformation that dominated in the 1990s, when it was the transformation from former socialist state-run societies to liberal democracies, and is now understood as a transformation or a multitude of transformations necessary to cope with global challenges like climate change or digitalization, etc., etc. So we see that on the one hand, transformations or transformation needs social cohesion as a precondition. That's the connects between the two. And on the other hand, transformation endangers social cohesion. So social cohesion being undermined by the challenges of transformation. So those who develop a good strategy and a good narrative for transformations are in the better position to master the challenges of their social cohesion. The third term, it's perhaps not a term, but it is a concept, that's the comeback of the state. So obviously, the debate about social cohesion has very much to do with expectations towards the state in its redistributive and regulatory power. Many people see that as starting with the pandemic, but I would argue that started with the 2008 crisis, when for the first time people realized that states, only of course the mighty ones, are able to buy banks. In the 1990s, everyone was convinced that banks are now too big for individual states, but all of a sudden it was realized, okay, states can save and own banks and resell them then to private owners after restoration of the situation, of their foundations. And that has obviously increased the expectation that the state is the protector against the risks of transformation, and insofar guarantees social cohesion. And that is what populists use by presenting the state as incapable to fulfill this promise. And here we see how both discourses, the negative and the positive discourse about social cohesion, or different ways of understanding social cohesion, are influenced by that reference to the state. And no one would publish nowadays a book, The Nation State is Dead, as it was in 1995. So very obviously we have to take this state into consideration when analyzing this international situation. The fourth thing is, I guess, something that is discussed since the 1980s, and that is the step-by-step culturalization of our understanding of society. So cultural belonging replaces socioeconomic positions. Holger Lengfeld has discussed that in length, to what extent cultural attitudes are an explanatory factor for attitudes or for support for the AfD in Germany, and we can go on with that for forever. There is on the one hand, this ever smaller groups of cultural belonging becoming important and dominating the discourse, and on the other hand, we see that enormous importance of the issue of cultural hegemony. When I was a student, I was very, very marginal with reading Gramsci. Nowadays, at least all the right has read Gramsci and thinks in terms of how to gain cultural hegemony. That's an interesting fact, and all this focus on what to do, how to use media, how to mobilize cultural groups and milieus instead of social milieus is a very interesting story. And social cohesion, which in its English version is a technical, I would say, a technical, professional term of sociology, has moved into something that is rather related to cultural studies and to the understanding, the cultural understanding of how societies hold together. And my fifth and last point, and then I will stop, is emotions. We have seen how emotions became an object of interest to historians, sociologists, and so on. But that was an academic interest. What we see now is to what extent emotions become important for doing politics, and how all this academic knowledge about the role of emotions is imported into political strategies. And I have no clue how we can really analyze that, but I would see this as a very central dimension to understand all kinds of concepts of social cohesion, not only those from the right side, by mobilizing emotions in order to gain majorities, in order to gain support, or to mobilize anger. Anger is obviously a very central term in all those attacks on current status of society and in the argument how a new social cohesion could be produced. And there are expectations towards an emotional performance of political leaders that are completely surprising, I guess, to people who would look from the 1970s to today's political class. Think only of Helmut Schmidt and the expectation towards the Scholzomat. Yeah, so the current leadership is permanently attacked of being not emotional enough. A very strange. So from today's perspective, completely understandable. But think only 30 years, 40 years back, then this would be a very strange attitude towards what you can expect from a chancellor or president, and so on and so on. So I guess these are elements, and as said in the introduction, these are elements that you can find in the semantic field around social cohesion. At the same time, they are hints at phenomena we can analyze, and not only as discursive elements. And insofar, I guess we have a lot of work in front of us. And I hope you are not angry with me when I have no conclusion. Thank you.
Dear Matthias, many thanks for your keynote, Social Cohesion, International Perspectives, and the deep insights into your work and research. Now we have some minutes left for the discussion, and yes, I'm running to you. Yes, please.
David Strecker, RISC Frankfurt. Thanks a lot for this. I'm wondering kind of how convinced I am by the link you established between social cohesion and populism. And actually wonder that you did so, considering that when you do intercultural and comparative research, you see that populism, polarization is actually a rather new phenomenon in the field of social cohesion research, and all the major analyses of the concept go back way further. They're from the 80s, 90s, and the noughties, so long before Trump and before populism became such a challenge in public perception. I mean, one of the main origins is 90s Canadian policy, where you do have a cultural link. It's social cohesion research there was linked to multiculturalism, but also with a view to structural factors affecting living conditions. Social cohesion has been primarily linked in the tradition of using the concept to the EU policy of social cohesion. That's to what the British call up-leveling policies, right? It's about living conditions, making them more equal. So all these cultural factors didn't really factor in social cohesion research a lot until quite recently. So I wonder in how far the conclusions you draw, the culturalization, the emotionalization, etc., and how far they are not symptoms of a rather recent adaptation of social cohesion research by a current challenge, which kind of lose view of the broader structural issues which have traditionally formed and fed the concept of social cohesion.
Can I ask back, what do you mean by social cohesion research? Obviously there is a long tradition of authors who have written about social cohesion. This is not what I'm addressing. The question is, when becomes social cohesion a central term for the self-narration of society? Mm-hmm. And that is different. I mean, I can, as an academic, write about whatever I want. No one in the society cares about it and uses these terms. The question is, when is that term really becoming a leading thing? I would agree with you that the multiculturalism debate was one where for the first time the question, is there a collapse of homogeneity? But was it social cohesion that was put at risk? The discourse, in the discourse. And the cohesion debate in the European Union, that is a very technocratic debate, right? That was not related to any public debate, isn't it?
I totally disagree.
Yeah, okay.
If you look at, I mean, not EU anymore, but if you look at Britain, for example, where the up-leveling debate, which is exactly the same, has a very broad public narrative. Mm-hmm. And of course, you have similar terms earlier on, which are more prominent in public discourse, but that's because social cohesion, I mean, you probably won't find much of public discourse where the term social cohesion actually plays much of a role. Mm-hmm. You find a very, very specific, very kind of parochial German discourse on gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt. Politically motivated, now fed by a certain institute, which has the effect of popularizing the term even more. There are other terms which are established, which speak to the same issues. And I think if we are just looking for one word, or in this case, two words, sozialer or gesellschaftlicher Zusammenhalt, and then only look at the German discourse, we kind of lose view of what the problem is.
Yeah, I can only agree that this is the point. Are we interested in the differences in the names given to the thing, or are we not interested in these discursive changes? If we are not interested, then we look for functional equivalents, and we find them in Middle Ages, we find them in the 18th century, we find them in the Nazi times, etc., etc. There is no problem to say social cohesion is everywhere. But then you confuse the current political discourse with an analytical term. That's my whole point.
So this is a really discussion.
Yeah.
So are there any further questions?
Thank you. I thought it was very interesting that you expanded the discussion on the relationship between social cohesion and populism from the more culturalized aspects and identity politics towards the question of monetary politics, and how we could maybe, I heard you as an invitation to think about states' regulatory activities on banks, and maybe an invitation to think of monetary policies as a form of social policies through which states can protect their citizens against economic and social risks. So I thought that was an interesting thought, if I follow you correctly. And then an extension probably on that. I mean, the Yellow Vests movement in France is, I think, a very good example of this kind of tendency. But then, and I also think what that opens up for is to think about varieties of populism. So how do populist movements and political parties relate to this demand for redistributive and regulatory activities, where we, I guess, see a huge variation within Europe and beyond. So this was more a commentary than a question, but I thought the idea and bringing in this material economic element to the discussion was very interesting. So thank you for that.
Thanks. Only to, I mean, what we have is a long series of movements we can call populist movements, which are not in power, and therefore they have not the redistributive power, but they claim to do something if they would gain power. But we have, of course, some regimes, and the minor ones like Hungary or Poland are examples of to whom it is then distributed. The big example, I guess, that is heavily interesting to people in most parts of the world except Europe is China. To what extent this enormous capacity of China to guide people out of complete poverty into a certain level of welfare is attractive to many regimes, and they try to understand what is the logic behind. Yeah? And insofar, I feel only invited with you to investigate that. We understand, I guess, not the attractiveness enough when looking only into the German debate, how many people in the world look at China or at India. Yeah? And I was intended to add another term to this emotion thing, and that is family. When you follow Modi's discourse, how he promotes social cohesion in his country, he speaks of a family, and I had never good family relations. Insofar, I can understand that exclusion is a very nice pattern in family relations, and that is what we see in India. Yeah? But only this remark.
Thanks a lot. I have to take a look at our time. We wanted to start the General Assembly at 4:15. Yep. So thanks a lot, Matthias, for your speech, for your presentation, and for the discussion.